On the night of June 3, 1629, a massive Dutch merchant vessel sliced through the pitch-black waters of the eastern Indian Ocean. She was the Batavia, 7 months out of Amsterdam, carrying 340 souls and a king's ransom in silver.
She was running at full sail, blind into uncharted waters. When she struck Morning Reef, the impact tore the 1,200-ton Leviathan apart.
Nearly 300 men, women, and children were cast away onto a cluster of waterless, windswept coral reefs 50 miles off the coast of Western Australia. But the greatest threat to their lives would not come from the sea, dehydration, or starvation.
It would come from an unhinged, bankrupt apothecary named Jeronimus Cornelisz, a man who saw their desperate isolation not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to build a personal death cult.
The Batavia was the brand new jewel of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the richest corporate empire on Earth.
Down in her holds sat 12 heavy chests packed with over 200,000 guilders in silver bullion, alongside a legendary 4th-century Roman agate cameo destined for the Mogul court. But beneath her decks, human rot had already set in.
The vessel was torn between two men who despised each other. Francisco Pelsart was the upper merchant, an Antwerp-born aristocrat charged with the cargo. Ariane Jacobs was the veteran, hard-drinking skipper who commanded the sails. Months of scurvy, brutal confinement, and open feuds over rank, and the unwanted advances made toward a high-born passenger named Lucretia Jans had driven Jacobs to the edge. Standing beside him on the quarterdeck was the ship's under-merchant, Jeronimus Cornelisz.
A Frisian apothecary who had fled Haarlem in disgrace, Cornelisz was a radical antinomian heretic who believed that because his will was inspired by God, he was fundamentally incapable of sin.
Together, the skipper and the heretic had spent the voyage across the Southern Ocean recruiting a secret clique of cutthroats. Their plan was simple: slit Pelsart's throat, throw over 200 loyal passengers overboard, seize the silver, and turn pirate. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. Instead, the ocean struck first.
At 3 a.m. on June 4, the lookout spotted white foam ahead. Skipper Jacobs waved it off as nothing more than moonbeams playing on the waves. Minutes later, the Batavia struck the reef at maximum speed. The coral tore away the rudder and impaled the oak hull, tossing hundreds of sleeping people into complete pandemonium. Up on deck, Pelsart confronted the skipper in his nightclothes, screaming over the deafening roar of the breakers. "What have you done, that through your reckless carelessness you have run this noose around our necks?" Desperate to lighten the ship, gunners hacked the cables and hurled 30 tons of bronze cannons into the sea. At dawn, Jacobs took an axe to fell the 180-foot Scandinavian pine mainmast. But they misjudged the cut. Instead of toppling into the surf, the 15-ton mast crashed directly down across the Batavia's own decks, crushing gear and destroying any remaining hope of refloating the ship. As the tide dropped, jagged coral teeth emerged on all sides. The Batavia began to buckle. Using the ship's small yawl and longboat, the crew ferried 180 men, women, and children to a flat, barren slab of coral rubble just a few hundred yards wide. It had no trees, no soil,
and not a single drop of fresh water.
In sight of the dying wreck, the survivors immediately dubbed it Batavia's graveyard. Back on the ship, discipline disintegrated completely.
Dozens of mutinous sailors broke into the wine lockers, dressing in the upper merchant's velvet clothes and hurling handfuls of silver coins at each other's heads in drunken delirium. On the islands, thirst began to kill.
Men drank their own urine and chewed on lead musket balls to draw spit.
On June 8, facing certain mass dehydration, Commodore Pelsart, Skipper Jacobs, and 46 select seamen made a fateful choice. They boarded the fully rigged longboat, ostensibly to search for water on the mainland.
When the Australian coast offered nothing but cliffs and surf, the officers kept rowing. They set a course for Java, an impossible 1,800-mile open-boat voyage across the Indian Ocean.
Left behind on the waterless reefs were roughly 250 abandoned souls, watching the sails of their only salvation disappear over the horizon. And stranded on the disintegrating hull of the wreck, clinging to the bowsprit, was the second most senior officer in the fleet.
Jeronimus Cornelisz was about to come ashore.
For 10 days, Jeronimus Cornelisz clung to the bowsprit of the disintegrating wreck, watching men drown around him. He was the last living soul to come ashore. Exhausted, shivering, and unable to swim, he was carried into camp not as a castaway, but as a savior.
With Pelsart gone, Jeronimus was the highest-ranking officer of the Dutch East India Company left in the archipelago. The survivors naturally deferred to him. He was given dry clothes, a private tent, and a seat at the head of the island's council.
To the outside world, he appeared to be an educated, refined gentleman of the Dutch Golden Age. But within the quiet confines of his tent, Jeronimus saw the 208 stranded men, women, and children through the lens of a monstrous theology. He was an antinomian.
He believed his soul was divinely unified with God, meaning no impulse, no desire, and no action of his could ever be considered sin. Worse, rumors were already whispering through the tents that a mutiny had been planned aboard the ship.
Jeronimus knew that if a VOC rescue ship arrived and took them back to Java, an investigation would torture the truth out of his Confederates. He would hang. His only survival lay in carrying out his original dream, seizing the rescue ship when it arrived, slaughtering its crew, and turning pirate with the Batavia's treasure chests. To hijack that ship, he needed absolute obedience.
And to make his rations last until that day came, he needed to eliminate all useless mouths.
Before he could begin the purge, Jeronimus had to neutralize the greatest threat to his authority: 45 disciplined, battle-hardened Dutch and German mercenary soldiers. He could not fight them openly, so he deployed deceit.
Calling forward a dependable common soldier named Wiebbe Hayes, Jeronimus ordered him to lead 20 of his best men across the Sound to the distant, barren high land to search for fresh water.
He gave them a promise: if they found water, they were to light signal fires, and boats would be sent to bring them food. Under the guise of standard VOC regulations, Jeronimus stripped the soldiers of their muskets, cutlasses, and pikeheads, and gave them no boats or rafts.
He left them on a waterless island 6 miles away, expecting dehydration to do his dirty work within a matter of days. Next, he exiled another 45 civilians and sick passengers across the deep-water channel to Seals Island.
With his strongest opponents scattered and unarmed, Jeronimus summoned his inner circle of conspirators: Cadet Konrad von Huyssen, Lance Corporal Jakob Peterzes, and his ruthless clerk, David Zevenank.
Together, they locked up every remaining blade and firearm in the under-merchant's tent. The slaughterhouse was ready.
The killing began under a veneer of martial law. First, a soldier was drowned for tapping a wine cask. Then, 2 carpenters were summarily executed with swords on trumped-up charges of plotting to steal a boat. Once Jeronimus dissolved the civilian council and appointed his mutineers in their place, all pretenses vanished. To bind his recruits into unbreakable loyalty, Cornelisz forced each man to draw blood. On July 10th, a young assistant named Andries de Vries was forced to creep into the sick tent and slit the throats of 11 bedridden patients suffering from scurvy. A few nights later, he returned to butcher 4 more.
To fall ill on Batavia's graveyard was an automatic death sentence. Nights on the island became a living nightmare. In the dark, the colony's seabirds shrieked with calls that sounded eerily like screaming children, masking the footsteps of death squads. Survivors lay in their tents, staring at the canvas walls, watching the bobbing yellow glow of watchmen's lanterns. Once a symbol of safety, that lantern light now meant the mutineers had chosen their next target. Men were strangled in their beds.
A carpenter was hacked to pieces by multiple knives. A gunner was butchered while begging to say his final prayers.
The mutineers threw off their woolen sailor clothes and strutted through the gore, dressed in the company's requisitioned red velvets, gold braid, and company silk, wearing scarves soaked in perfume to mask the stench of death.
Over 120 innocent people, men, women, and children, would be systematically eliminated on Batavia's graveyard and the surrounding rocks. Jeronimus Cornelisz believed his domain was absolute.
He had no idea that across the water, the men he had left to die of thirst were not only alive, they were watching.
When Jeronimus marooned Wiebbe Hayes and his 20 soldiers on the high land, he believed nature would execute them without leaving blood on his hands. Stripped of their weapons, without a single boat, and abandoned on what appeared to be an arid lump of rock 6 miles away, the soldiers were supposed to die of thirst within a week. Instead, the highland was a fortress in disguise. While Batavia's graveyard descended into a slaughterhouse over scarce foul wine and puddle water, Wiebbe Hayes and his men searched every foot of the larger island. Deep inside natural limestone depressions, they found something that didn't exist anywhere else in the archipelago: permanent natural cisterns of cool, pure, fresh water. Better yet, the island was teeming with life. Unlike the scraped bare coral rocks to the south, the highland was home to thousands of nesting seabirds, abundant fish, and colonies of small hopping marsupials called tamer wallabies. The men Jeronimus intended to starve were eating fresh meat and drinking clean water every single day. Faithfully following their original orders, the soldiers gathered brushwood on July 9th and ignited 3 massive signal fires along the shoreline.
To Hayes, the 3 pillars of smoke meant, "We found water. Bring the survivors." To Jeronimus, watching through a spyglass across miles of open ocean, the smoke meant his nightmare was beginning. Days passed, but no rescue boats ever sailed from Batavia's graveyard. Instead, the soldiers on the high land watched in confusion as plumes of smoke drifted from the other islets, followed by complete silence. Then the truth washed ashore.
Surviving passengers and sailors, desperate men who had managed to construct crude timber rafts or swim across shark-infested deep-water channels, began washing up on Hayes's beaches.
Among them were survivors who had witnessed the butchery firsthand, men who had watched the provost's family cut down in cold blood, and sailors who had narrowly escaped the midnight massacres on Seal's Island.
They fell to their knees in front of Wiebbe Hayes and told him what had become of the Batavia's company. Commodore Pelsart had not returned.
Jeronimus Cornelisz was not running a rescue council. He had dissolved the authority of the Dutch East India Company and established a murderous death cult. Over 100 innocent people were already dead, their bodies dumped into mass graves or thrown to the sharks.
And the mutineers were systematically hunting down anyone who remained. The population on the high land swelled to 45 men. But unlike the terrified civilians on the other islets, these were soldiers.
And under the leadership of a common private from Winschoten, they decided they would not die on their knees.
Wiebbe Hayes knew that as soon as Jeronimus realized the soldiers knew the truth, an assault was inevitable. The mutineers held all the firearms, all the steel cutlasses, and both of the company yawls. Hayes's men had nothing, no muskets, no armor, no swords.
So they built a war machine out of the island itself. Hauling massive slabs of flat limestone from the shoreline, Hayes organized his men into building crews.
High on a defensive rise overlooking the channel, they dry-stacked stone walls to create 2 fortified shelters with firing steps and interlocking fields of view. These crude stone redoubts, which still stand intact today, would become the very first European structures ever built on the Australian continent. Next came weapons. Scouring the tide lines for heavy driftwood spars, the soldiers crafted long defensive pikes, driving 16-inch iron bolts and heavy nails salvaged from wreckage through the timber tips to create vicious thrusting spears. They poured melted lead around hardwood shafts, studding the clubs with jagged nails to invent brutal trench-style morning stars. Along the stone parapets, they stockpiled thousands of smooth, fist-sized limestone rocks, training everyday soldiers to whip them with slings at lethal velocities. By late July 1629, the lines were drawn. 6 miles to the south, Jeronimus Cornelisz and his mutineers were drinking stolen wine, draped in velvet, preparing their boats to exterminate the last pocket of resistance. 6 miles to the north, behind stone battlements, 45 well-fed, disciplined soldiers stood in ranks with improvised spears, waiting in the shallows. The battle for the Abrolhos was about to begin. By late July, Jeronimus Cornelisz realized that Wiebbe Hayes's fortress on the highland was an existential threat. If a rescue ship arrived, the soldiers would expose the slaughter. If no ship came, Hayes controlled the only permanent fresh water in the archipelago. The soldiers had to be exterminated. Jeronimus launched 2 successive boat-borne amphibious assaults. He sent his best enforcers, David Zevank, Konrad van Huysen, and their heavily armed inner circle. They expected the marooned troops to be weak, sickly, and defenseless.
Instead, as the mutineers' yawls grounded on the reefs, Hayes didn't cower behind his stone walls. He led his men straight into the shallows. Standing shoulder to shoulder in waist-deep water, the soldiers formed an impenetrable wall of driftwood pikes tipped with 16-inch iron bolts. Behind them, slingers rained jagged limestone rocks with bone-shattering force. Undisciplined, encumbered by their stolen velvets, and facing desperate men fighting for their lives, the mutineers broke. Both attacks were repelled with humiliating losses. For the first time since the Batavia struck the reef, Jeronimus Cornelisz was losing. Failing with brute force, the apothecary turned back to deceit. On September 2, Jeronimus himself sailed to the high land with a small escort, carrying a white flag and gifts of fine cloth, wine, and promises of shared command. He believed his legendary silver tongue could divide the soldiers and bribe them into submission. It was the greatest miscalculation of his life. Wiebbe Hayes had forbidden his men from speaking with the mutineers.
The moment Jeronimus stepped onto the beach to open negotiations, Hayes sprang an ambush. Soldiers swarmed from behind the rocks. In a matter of seconds, they overwhelmed the escort.
Cadet Coenrat von Hysen and 3 other key mutineers were run through and killed on the spot. David Zevenak was cut down in the melee. Jeronimus was tackled to the coral, disarmed, and bound hand and foot with heavy hemp rope.
The self-proclaimed God King of Batavia's graveyard was dragged into Hayes's stone redoubt, a helpless prisoner of the common soldier he had sent to die. Back on Batavia's graveyard, the surviving mutineers panicked. Now led by a soldier named Walter Luce, they gathered their final advantage, the ship's salvaged firearms. On September 17, Luce launched a desperate third counteroffensive against the high land. Armed with matchlock muskets, the mutineers kept their distance, circling the stone fort and firing lead balls directly into the parapets. 4 of Hayes's men were wounded. Without firearms of their own, the soldiers were pinned down inside their limestone fortress, unable to charge without being cut to pieces. Then, right as the mutineers reloaded for a final deadly push, a white sail appeared on the northern horizon. It was the Sardam, a VOC rescue yacht dispatched from Java, commanded by Francisco Pelsart. Against all odds, the upper merchant had survived the 1,800-mile open-boat voyage to Batavia and returned to recover the company's silver and rescue the castaways.
Across the Sound, both sides knew what that sail meant. If the mutineers reached the Sardam first, they planned to board peacefully as survivors, cut Pelsart's throat, slaughter the skeleton crew, and seize the ship. A desperate race erupted across the reef.
Wiebbe Hayes and 2 men leaped into their light rowing skiff, rowing with every ounce of strength they had left. Behind them, a boat loaded with armed mutineers pulled furiously to cut them off. Hayes won the race by bare seconds. He scrambled up the Sardam's boarding ladder, exhausted, soaked, and breathless. He found Pelsart on the quarterdeck and shouted a frantic warning. "The Batavia is lost. The men in the approaching boat are bloody murderers. Train your guns."
Moments later, the mutineers' boat pulled alongside. Instead of an unsuspecting crew, they looked directly down the barrels of the Sardam's loaded cannons and muskets. Pelsart ordered them to drop their weapons or be blown out of the water.
Without firing a single shot, the mutiny was crushed.
Pelsart went ashore and discovered the full, horrifying reality of Batavia's graveyard: empty campsites, ransacked treasure, and mass burial pits containing over 100 innocent victims. Because transporting dozens of murderous mutineers back to Java on a small ship risked another uprising, Pelsart convened an immediate field tribunal on the islands. Jeronimus Cornelisz was put on trial. Even when confronted with the confessions of his men, the apothecary showed neither remorse nor fear, maintaining that everything he had done was ordained by God. On October 2, 1629, on the sands of Seal's Island, justice was carried out. Before climbing the gallows, Jeronimus and his chief enforcers had their right hands severed with a hammer and chisel. Then they were hanged. 2 junior mutineers were deliberately marooned on the Australian mainland, becoming the first recorded permanent European residents of the continent. Back in the Netherlands, Wiebbe Hayes was celebrated as a national hero, promoted directly to sergeant with a lifetime pension. Today, on the wind-swept coral of West Wallaby Island, the crude, dry stone walls built by Hayes and his 20 soldiers still stand intact against the roaring Southern Ocean. They remain a silent, haunting monument to the 45 forgotten men who stood against madness and held the line.